This is Detective Recapped. Today I'm going to explain an erotic crime thriller film called Bitter Moon. Draped in an excessive exhibition of nudity and obscene eroticism, Bitter Moon is a polarizing piece of cinema that's bound to leave someone in the audience feeling uncomfortable, if not downright astounded. However, underneath its excess is a cautionary tale that all relationships can benefit learning from. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. As the song goes, there are 50 ways to leave your lover. You can slip out the back, make a new plan, hop on the bus, or without even much of a discussion, you can just drop off the key and leave. Unfortunately, when it comes to fixing relationships, you don't have as many options, but a popular route for this is taking a nice trip, and that's what our couple is doing. For their 7-year wedding anniversary trip, a young British couple ride in the Mediterranean cruise ship to Istanbul en route to India. Fiona Dobson is overjoyed that she can finally go on this trip with her husband, Nigel, and she hopes that it would help with their marital problems. Fiona excuses herself for a moment to use the bathroom, and Nigel stays on deck while watching the waves over the horizon. Time passes, so a concerned Nigel checks on his wife to see if she is alright. To his surprise, Fiona is tending to a young and beautiful French woman who's severely seasick. Fiona and Nigel lead the French woman out onto the deck so she could get some fresh air. She's courteous towards the two, even complimenting Fiona's beauty. After telling her where they're headed, Fiona asks where the French woman is going, and she only says that she's planning to go somewhere much farther. Later on, Fiona and Nigel have a pleasant lunch with an Indian gentleman and widower named Isaiah. All seems well with the British couple, however, underneath this veneer of normalcy, the Dobsons are growing weary of each other in their marriage. After all, the absence of excitement and novelty are insidious things that can poison minds and relationships alike. But perhaps a change in scenery will help the couple revive what remains of their relationship. During the night, Nigel heads to the ship's in-house bar alone where he finds a woman dancing. Nigel sits down at the bar and orders a drink while ogling at her. The woman ends her dance and walks down to the bar to have a drink. Nigel then recognizes her as the French woman from earlier. He asks if she's feeling any better, but the French woman playfully feigns any memory of Nigel. She then demands Nigel to tell her something funny. Nigel awkwardly tries to come up with something, but he fails to amuse her. She stands up and leaves, sarcastically remarking on Nigel's quote-unquote magnetic personality. Of course, it wouldn't be a save-the-marriage cruise if there's no enigmatic and charismatic woman in black who won't make her intentions clear. Nevertheless, the sudden change in her demeanor is certainly confusing. It gives rise to the suspicion that the woman was just putting up an act earlier. Now she's being excessively flirtatious and playful with Nigel despite knowing that he has a wife. Nigel stands on the side of the deck once again, staring at the pitch-black waves. Suddenly, he is approached by a man in a wheelchair named Oscar. He calls him by name, much to Nigel's surprise. Oscar talks to him about Mimi, the French woman. He says that Mimi is his wife, then accuses Nigel of wanting to sleep with her. Forebodingly, he warns Nigel to be wary of her, saying that she was the one who caused him to be in a wheelchair. Oscar's candor flusters Nigel, and at this point, he asks Nigel to help him up the elevated doorstep. Nigel complies, and he follows Oscar into his cabin. Though Oscar seems perfectly harmless, there's still an unfathomable air to their meeting. The very premise of their conversation is bizarre, seeing as Oscar is the husband of the woman who he accused Nigel of wanting to sleep with, and that isn't even the only thing that makes their whole setup odd, if not questionable. Oscar offers Nigel a glass of champagne as he begins to tell his story. He met Mimi in Paris on a shuttle ride. Oscar sat near her inside the shuttle, and he had his eyes glued to her the entire time. When Oscar realized that Mimi didn't have a ticket, he slid his own ticket in her hand. This in turn led him to being kicked out onto the street. The bus rode away, and Mimi looked over at Oscar with hazy, spellbound eyes. Oscar explains that he was an aspiring writer who moved to Paris to follow the footsteps of his literacy heroes. Unfortunately, all his novels were rejected by publishers. After their first encounter, Oscar was love-struck, and he pursued the bus route regularly, so much so that the drivers began to recognize him. One day, he approached a woman, hoping it was Mimi, but it wasn't. Still, he took her to a restaurant, and in a fortuitous turn of events, the waitress serving them was Mimi. As Mimi left with their order, Oscar followed closely behind her and asked her out to dinner the next day. After picking Mimi up from her dance lessons, the two of them went to eat at a Thai restaurant. An awkward silence fell over them, but it wasn't forced or labored. There was an innocent lightness to it. Eventually, the two found themselves in an endearing game of pantomime. In their attempts to one-up each other, they ended up sharing a warm laugh. The world is abound with powerful forces, but few hit as hard as pulse-pounding attraction does. Oscar was consumed by it in all its intensity, and it led him to a beautiful and blossoming romance with the beauty that was Mimi. But everything fades, and Oscar must know this very well now. The two of them then went out on a late-night stroll. When the sun rose, they sat on a bench. There, Oscar admitted that he's been looking for her. In turn, Mimi took out the ticket he gave her, and Oscar was touched that she kept it this whole time. When Mimi said that her feet were cold, Oscar took them both and warmed them up with his hands and breath. Later on, the two lovebirds retreated to Oscar's apartment. Mimi took off Oscar's necktie and shirt, and with the both of them undressed, they made love to each other. From then on, Oscar and Mimi spent their days staying home, making love and being in love. At this point, Oscar starts describing in increasing detail the erotic aspects of their relationship to Nigel, who is now feeling uncomfortable with all the obscenity. Oscar reasons that he's going into such detail because he's trying to get across how hopelessly smitten he was. Nigel bids Oscar goodbye after listening to his story. This perverse storytelling suddenly changes Oscar's character from a pitiful old man to an inappropriate and somewhat frightening stranger. But most inappropriate of it all is perhaps the way Nigel almost seems to enjoy Oscar's lewd accounts of his and Mimi's torrid affair. Even more so, Nigel is hopelessly fascinated by Oscar's wife. Nigel comes back to his little cabin to find Fiona fast asleep. He embraces her, feeling winded after the conversation with Oscar. The next morning, Nigel tells Fiona what happened the previous night, and Fiona chuckles. Rather appalled by Oscar's ways, she comments that he's a verbal exhibitionist. The two eat breakfast at the ship's cafeteria, and suddenly, Oscar and Mimi enter the room. Fiona hopes that they won't join them, but Oscar goes to say hello. Oscar motions Mimi to a different table with some important-looking officials, while he stays with the couple. The two of them agree out of courtesy. Ordering nothing but wine, Oscar almost immediately compliments Fiona's beauty. Throughout the entire lunch, Oscar dominates the conversation with his own brand of dark humor. After a while, they are joined at the table by Mimi, who sits across from Nigel. Underneath the table, Mimi plays footsies with the quiet Nigel. Oscar asks for Fiona's permission to borrow Nigel to hear the rest of his story. Despite her fluster, Fiona complies. When Oscar and Mimi depart, they leave the other couple feeling dazed at the table by the bizarre encounter. For whatever reason, the two are completely overwhelmed by Oscar's insistent attitude that even though they're uncomfortable with the idea, Fiona especially, they still go along with it. But beyond that, this scene highlights the ironic parallels between the two wedded pairs. On one hand, Nigel and Fiona had both run the course of their marriage and things are starting to feel stale. Meanwhile, Oscar and Mimi had driven their married life to its extremes, and now the two are worn out by the throes of passion and cruelty. Back at Oscar's cabin, Nigel is sat listening to his story once again. He explains that just as he felt that his relationship with Mimi had run its course, something happened which changed everything. One afternoon, Mimi and Oscar went on a skiing trip. Mimi lay sprawled out on the floor wearing nothing but a t-shirt while watching television. He was surprised when Mimi stood up, positioned herself on the TV set, and started pissing all over it. Mimi's urine is sprayed all over Oscar, and he reports that he had the best climax of his life. At this point, Nigel's through listening to Oscar drone on about how he found his fountain of youth and second baptism in his wife's excretions. Oscar tells him to quiet down as he's sharing a revelation with him to expand his sensual horizons. He even jabs at Nigel's inadequate intimate life with Fiona. When Nigel gets mad and retorts that Oscar is downright obscene, Oscar simply asks if he's ever felt empowering passion and if he's ever truly idolized a woman. With that, he continues with his tale, and this time, he's talking about the time Mimi strapped him to a chair, tied his hands, gagged him, and slashed his clothes apart before finally having her way with him. More days passed by where the two had stayed in their apartment and made love. Oscar's questions about passion and idolatry are very telling. They show that he's a man driven by novelty and the all too fleeting notion of passion in a relationship. He says as much with his stories, only when Mimi tried something new, extreme, and perverse did they feel reignited again. The scene may be lurid and excessive in its obscenities, and Nigel even pointed it out, but that's precisely what Oscar wanted and needed. Fearing that their relationship was going stale, Oscar arranged for a night out with their friends. During the revelry, Mimi spotted Oscar having a laugh with her old roommate. Mimi began to feel jealous, so she walked over to her acquaintance from dance class and began to dance with him in a very sensual manner. Oscar felt hurt by this, so he walked out of the lounge and took a cab home. Mimi came home shortly after, feeling guilty for what had happened. Mimi began sobbing profusely and told Oscar how much she loved him. Oscar loved her too, but he feared that their intimate life was about to decline. In a last attempt to reinvigorate things, they started to roleplay. Oscar pretended to be a pig and Mimi kept whipping him. However, this didn't work out as they hoped and it failed to turn them on. The couple gave up and Oscar realized that finally, the flames of desire had all burned out. Before being able to continue the story, Mimi walks into the room and Nigel stands up, trying to get away from the situation. Again, Oscar subtly suggests that Nigel wants to sleep with Mimi. Nigel leaves the room and once he closed the door, he can hear the strange couple laugh. For a moment, he can't help but feel like he's being subjected to the couple's lewd and bizarre games. Perhaps Nigel should have quit there. Perhaps he should have taken this as a warning that he was being played. But the temptation and the excitement are too much for him to resist. He's right, Oscar is obscene. He's a vulgar pervert who's likely toying with him, but only in Oscar's stories is he privy to such an electric and pulse-pounding world, one that he probably can't imagine having given his tame relationship with his wife. But perhaps the most magnetic factor in all of this is Mimi herself, who Nigel remains undoubtedly enticed by. Nigel comes back to his own cabin where Fiona is waiting for him. Fiona is upset, feeling jealous of Mimi. With Nigel trying to console her, they head out to the deck. There, they encounter Isaiah, the Indian gentleman they befriended the day before. With him is his daughter, Amrita. Fiona immediately takes a liking to Amrita, so Isaiah asks Nigel if they have children of their own. Fiona says that Nigel doesn't want to have children. Feeling awkward, Nigel starts to change the subject. Fiona remarks that she feels cold and Isaiah generously offers his coat while Nigel goes back to the cabin to retrieve Fiona's own coat. On Nigel's way back to the cabin, Mimi intercepts him and she warns that not everything Oscar tells him is true. She then asks Nigel to come to see her in her cabin at 5 p.m. because she wants to explain some things to him. After this encounter, Nigel returns to Fiona carrying her coat, and the married couple head inside the lounge for a game of bridge with the other folks on the ship. Nigel impatiently looks over to his watch, waiting for 5 p.m., and when it's time, he stands up and tells his wife that Oscar's requesting another meeting. This makes Fiona upset, but she lets him go anyway. At this point, Oscar is absolutely hooked. He longs for Mimi and is willing to lie to his wife, perhaps even cheat to get a good whiff of her. It is at this moment that Nigel loses his innocence in the situation and steps further into the storm that was brewing. When Nigel arrives to the cabin, it is completely dark. He hears Mimi instructing him to close the door. The outline of her body is lying there on the bed. Nigel goes to kiss Mimi's hand, and suddenly the lights turn on. Mimi emerges from behind Nigel, exiting the cabin in a rush. It's revealed that Oscar is the one lying on the bed, and it makes the couple laugh when Nigel had kissed his hand. Nigel is completely outraged with the couple's games, but Oscar tells it to him straight. He'll let Nigel have an affair with Mimi on the condition that he listens to the entire story. Nigel explains that he no longer has the functioning body parts to satisfy Mimi, so he's given up preventing any affairs. Now, he helps supervise them. Needless to say, Nigel's being played by the twisted couple. He has become a part of another one of their sick games, and because Oscar is dangling Mimi in front of him like a carrot, Nigel is powerless against them. Perhaps powerless is the wrong word, because Nigel isn't being held at gunpoint. As mentioned earlier, attraction is one of the world's most powerful forces, and it's completely run Nigel over, leaving him paralyzed by the couple and subservient to their whims. Nigel sits down and Oscar continues the rest of his story. Oscar's repeated failure of getting his work published led to the festering of a cynical attitude within him. In turn, he's lost his passion for Mimi, and day by day he resented her for his failures. Boredom set in and Oscar resorted to an escorting service because he no longer felt aroused by Mimi. One afternoon, a violent argument erupted and Oscar knocked Mimi unconscious for a moment. Feeling guilty, Oscar brought Mimi to the carnival and they spent a good day together. However, Oscar finally voiced out his grim outlook on their relationship, saying he always thought it wouldn't last and it would be best to let it die. Mimi tried to convince him otherwise, but Oscar insisted. Mimi finally gave it up and left. It's evident just how selfish Oscar is as a person. He cares more for the thrills he could experience rather than the people in his life, so he was ready to give up his relationship with Mimi out of boredom. That would have been for the best anyway, since Oscar was just taking his frustration out on Mimi. But perhaps Oscar is still hung up on his failures as a writer to this day, that he settles for having Nigel listen to his pompous retelling of his life. For the next few days, Mimi continued to reach out to Oscar to take her back, but Oscar rejected her every time. One evening, when Oscar was coming back from a bar, he saw Mimi sleeping on the floor by his door. Fearing the prying eyes of his neighbors, he let her come into the room. There, Mimi got down on her knees to beg Oscar to take her back. Mimi went as far to say that Oscar can shout at her, have other women, and even stop loving her as long as he let her stay with him. When Mimi said this, Oscar began to form a dark, sadistic idea. While Oscar agreed to keep his relationship with Mimi, he made it his mission to subject her to a living hell so that Mimi would give up on their relationship. What followed this was a life of absolute cruelty for Mimi. Oscar would frequently call her a different woman's name to hurt her. He bullied her and berated her every opportunity he found. One evening, Mimi cooked a Thanksgiving dinner for Oscar, but he refused to eat it and he even insulted her cooking skills. Oscar then asked Mimi why she no longer had her dance classes. Mimi said she could no longer dance because her heart was broken. Eventually, it came to a point where Mimi was affected physically. Hives would break out and her hair became frizzy and wild. Oscar would sometimes insult her in front of the woman he was having an affair with. Oscar's cruelty reached a point where he forced Mimi to have an abortion when he found out that she was pregnant. It's difficult to fault Mimi for her actions. They were done out of love and desperation, though those feelings were clearly misplaced and directed towards the worst person possible. But we also see how Oscar took this vulnerability and used it for his sadistic games. The operation was a success, but several complications left Mimi in a terribly weakened state. Seeing Mimi in such poor condition had finally penetrated his stone-cold heart. Oscar felt himself weaken when Mimi opened her eyes after the operation, and he promised Mimi that the two of them will go on a trip once she felt better. Oscar and Mimi boarded the plane to Martinique. In a final act of cruelty, Oscar made sure that Mimi left in the plane without him, getting rid of her for good. In a heartbreaking scene, Mimi looked back frantically in the plane while looking for Oscar, but as the plane took off, the realization set in that Oscar had abandoned her. From then on, what remained of the sweet and loving Mimi had died in that plane, but as we've seen, it wasn't a swift death. Oscar had murdered that Mimi, but he butchered her day by day until she was beyond recognition. Nigel and Oscar conclude the session for now. Nigel exits the room to see Mimi waiting by the door. Mimi asks him if he's angry with her, but Nigel says he is confused. The two of them share a kiss before Nigel leaves. Nigel moves to the dining area, but by the time he gets there, dinner is already over. He tries to look for Fiona at the bar, and he sees her flirting with an Italian man. Nigel takes Fiona with him back to their cabin. On the way there, Nigel complains about Fiona's flirting, but Fiona responds that she knows that Nigel wants to sleep with Mimi. The next evening, Fiona is totally leveled by seasickness. Nigel suggests she takes a pill. This angers Fiona and she goes on a tirade about how he's always making her take pills before complaining about not having any children. But eventually, Fiona gives in and agrees to take the pill. When Nigel gives her 2 instead of 1, Fiona angrily lashes out and asserts that Nigel should go ahead and sleep with Mimi. He storms out in a rage and heads to Oscar to hear the rest of the story. As if their stale marriage isn't enough to drive a wedge between them, their differing values and wants in life sparks the tension further. So of course, all Nigel can do is lose himself more in Oscar and Mimi's game. There, he doesn't have any obligation or responsibility, and there, the passion and excitement light a fire in him. Oscar spent the 2 years that passed lapping up the myriad of beautiful women in Paris. One day, Oscar got hit by a bus, causing a fracture in his leg. To his surprise, he was visited by Mimi, who feigned courtesy, but soon enough Mimi grabbed hold of his arm and dragged him to the floor while his legs were in terrible condition. In the end, Oscar was paralyzed from the waist down. Strangely enough, Mimi devoted herself to taking care of Oscar. She stayed with him and served him with strong devotion, but now and again, Mimi played out her twisted whims on Oscar with a vengeance. Oscar, who was completely helpless to Mimi, started to realize that maybe she still loved him in her own messed up way. Still, that was a cruel bit of vengeance on her end. Not only did she rob him of his mobility, but she also made it so that he has no one else to turn to and nowhere else to go but her. Mimi had every bit of a revenge in the end, but had the last laugh. Mimi continually degraded Oscar and denied him all of life's pleasures as much as she could. There was even a time when Mimi made love to one of her friends directly in front of him. But despite all this, Oscar and Mimi knew that only with each other did they share a bond of extreme passion and extreme cruelty. As such, they decided to get married. Oscar admits to Nigel that he is forever afraid of losing Mimi's love, as twisted as it is to someone else. With this, Oscar concludes his story and sends Nigel away to let him decide if he'll have an affair with Mimi. Now, Nigel has completed the horrid story of the twisted and demented couple, but none of what he had heard so far dissuades him from going after Mimi. Several red flags are abound, and there has always been a permeating sense that he's just getting toyed with. Still, against logic and reason, he keeps his sights set on Mimi. Nigel returns to his cabin and finds Fiona still knocked out cold. He decides to head to the lounge where a New Year's Eve night gala is held. Nigel goes to join Mimi to dance, although Nigel dances poorly. The ridiculous dancing prowess of Hugh Grant does break the mood of this otherwise serious film, and this is quite a feat considering that a character here has likened a golden shower to the fountain of youth. Nigel tells Mimi he's going to get a drink, but Mimi does not react. The New Year countdown begins and Mimi heads towards Nigel. She motions for him to kiss her cheek. A confused Nigel stands dumbfounded until Mimi takes his hands and slow dances with him on the dance floor. Nigel tries to kiss Mimi, but she refuses, telling him ominously that he hasn't heard the end of their story yet. This is when Mimi mentions that his wife is there, watching the two of them. Nigel looks over at the bar and sees Fiona standing next to Oscar. Nigel walks over and tries to come up with an excuse, but Fiona saw everything. She tells him that Oscar made her come there. Fiona then sees Mimi dancing and she goes to join her. Nigel is forced to watch as his wife and his almost mistress dance sensually and kiss intimately in front of everyone. Suddenly, the ship tips to the side, and the entire party falls over. After everyone settles down again, Mimi and Fiona head to the cabins. Oscar laughs at the chaotic farce while Nigel storms out of the room. If you find yourself wondering what just happened, you aren't alone. Nigel himself can do nothing but wonder that. He was supposed to have his wife still knocked out cold so he can knock some strange and crazed woman up with the blessing of her equally strange and crazed husband. Angry and now confused, Nigel finally realizes that he's the loser in the situation. Moments later, Nigel wakes up in his cabin from a drunken stupor. He heads to Oscar's cabin where he sees Fiona and Mimi sleeping naked while Oscar sits there waiting for him. Oscar claims that the two women made love, taunting Nigel to his limits. This has the enraged Nigel choking Oscar, so Oscar pulls out a gun, making Nigel retreat. But in a frightening turn of events, Oscar breaks down in tears and he points the gun at Mimi. He shoots her twice before putting the gun inside his mouth and fires it once. Nigel and Fiona are in a state of shock and the two of them retreat to the upper deck as Mimi and Oscar's bodies are retrieved by paramedics. Isaiah urges his young daughter Amarita to walk over to the scared couple to comfort them. Finally, Nigel and Fiona embrace one another in the aftermath of the bizarre and traumatizing experience. For all of its vulgarities and bizarre perversion, the film is an examination of a relationship at its best and at its worst. In the film, we are introduced to two married couples. The first are Nigel and Fiona. They both lead relatively uneventful lives, which becomes the main reason why their relationship has gone stale. They venture off to another country to find excitement. However, they go on to find that the remedy for their lack of connection isn't exploration, but it's how they should lean on each other. They learn this in the most traumatizing way by observing and participating in the cruel and chaotic life of another couple, Oscar and Mimi. Throughout the film, we learn that Oscar and Mimi were the antithesis to Nigel and Fiona. While Nigel and Fiona suffered from a lack of passion, Oscar and Mimi had too much of it. Everything they did was all about excess. Both their lovemaking and their cruelty were taken to extremes, so much that it has scarred them and turned them into broken people. When Nigel and Fiona cross paths with the wild couple, they end up learning from their mistakes. That excess and excitement may not be the end-all be-all remedy to a struggling relationship. So at the very end of the film, during Oscar and Mimi's planned murder-suicide, we're given the impression that the corrupt couple intended for all of those things to happen as a cautionary tale for Nigel and Fiona. The only character in the film who seemed to live life contently was Isaiah. While Isaiah was a widower, he had his young and innocent daughter, Amrita. And we don't learn much about Isaiah's married life, but symbolically, Amrita proved to be a product of their love. The sweet girl continued to be a source of comfort for Isaiah, and by the end of the film, Amrita comforted Nigel and Fiona as well. This symbolized a new hope that things can move forward for the couple, especially with the knowledge that they must not let their relationship turn bitter as Oscar and Mimi's did.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.